trying to acquire godlikeness. The term in Arabic is Sajjad Rizvi. And this is something which is already articulated very early on by philosophers in the Islamic tradition. And it comes out of a Platonic conception of what philosophy is. So the quest of the philosopher is to try to be as godlike as possible in your understanding of what the cosmos and of reality, what it is, in the way in which the divine demiurge of the cosmos in Plato's Timaeus in particular is. And so that raises the question of, is there more than just demonstration which might be involved? What role might poesis, might poetry, metaphysics of aesthetics and presence play within this context? And so, as we see, as history develops, we see this concept of hikmah in the Islamic traditions becoming richer to incorporate these different approaches. There is a kind of a burhan demonstration element of it. It takes on elements of intuition and poesis and rhetoric, and it also takes on this very important notion of the imitation of the divine. Now, one of the elements of this kind of understanding is then to make sense of how philosophers and philosophical traditions considered what they thought of poetry. And this is, again, one where we can see a very interesting development from Aristotle and Plato to the later traditions. So famously, we know about Plato. He states, as you have here in the quotation from the Republic, that there is an old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. And he famously wanted to expel poets from the Republic. The perfect state would not have any poets, because the fundamental problem for him was that poets mislead and corrupt people by persuading them of false ideas and notions, because they are couched in aesthetically pleasing form. Now, of course, it then also raises the question of why can't a poet do the opposite? Why can't the poet actually express true ideas and true notions and couch them in aesthetically pleasing form? But that was the fundamental problem that Plato had, of how he understood the difference between poetry and philosophy. And we find this a bit more explicitly worked out in Aristotle. So Aristotle recognizes that poetry is a form of persuasion. In everything we do, in language, the way in which we communicate, we speak to each other, we are always in the process of trying to convince each other of something, right? And we do it in different ways. We do it through what we might call logical argument. We do it through rhetorical devices. We sometimes do it through poetry. We sometimes do it through things which are unsaid but indicated through sort of non-linguistic forms of communication. Right? And so Aristotle built up a certain hierarchy of what these forms of persuasion were. And for him, logic and demonstration was the highest form, and poetry was a lesser form, because it didn't necessarily stem from fixed and certain principles, but rather it often used the attraction of words and the attraction of images and things which are not necessarily fixed to make its argument. Now, in the Islamic traditions as they developed, there was in many ways a recognition of the supremacy of demonstration in philosophy. But there was also this recognition that poetry had an important role to play in argument and persuasion. And so by the time we get to a much later period, what we see is a scene in which the significance of poetry as it develops in Arabic and later in Persian becomes very much central to how we understand persuasion. So here I've given you three kind of examples of how 18th, 19th century figures dealt with this issue of poetry and philosophy. So The earliest in this listing is Azad Bilrami. Again, I don't know how many people in Pakistan or India work on Azad Bilrami. It's kind of almost shameful that I would expect nothing else. But the simple fact is, he was a huge figure, a great Arabic poet, a great Persian poet, a very important Sufi thinker. And his work, Subhat al-Marjan, again apologies for the typos, which is a 2-volume work in Arabic. I don't know if it's ever been translated into Urdu, but it certainly should have if it hasn't. It's a wonderful praise, actually, to Hindustan, and about the significance and centrality of poetry and philosophy in Hindustan, the great contribution of these 2 elements of the arts of persuasion, and also the role that the school of Ibn Arabi, to which I will come in a bit, played in that dissemination. He himself was very much a thinker who was influenced by the thought and the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, but he also recognized that it was practically impossible to engage in philosophy and poetry, theology also, if you will, in this context without Ibn Arabi. The second one I've got here is a writer of a very interesting tazkira of poets. Again, the date is wrong, it should be 1802, apologies. Nishtara Ishq. It's probably one of the best later tazkiras on Persian poets, which extensively includes Indian poets. And one of the things he emphasizes here is that by the time you get to the 18th century, Sufism, particularly the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, the devotional school, and philosophy, by which is meant hikmah, it's very difficult to separate the 2. It's extremely difficult to separate the 2, and there's a wide recognition that these themes were then animating the poetry of different Persian poets, certainly by this period. And then the third one, of course, is Shibli Nomani. I mean, again, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Shibli. I personally find Shibli problematic in many, many ways, and I'm not going to go into the critique here, but he does some interesting things in Shi'r al-Ajam. Not only this, I think, important point that he makes, that poetry is not just Latif and Qafiyah, right? It's not just meter and rhyme, but it's actually inspired, effective speech. It's about the effective use of the conscience, right? So it's about much more than just meter and rhyme. Meter and rhyme, as we know, does not make a poet. There has to be something much more in it. And in his part 5 of his work, he discusses extensively motifs and themes in poetry. And within that, he emphasizes that Sufism, the focus on wujud, the focus on metaphysics arising out of the school of Arabi, and then expressed through very significant poets such as Fakhruddin Iraqi, Maghribi, Shah al-Badi, etc., were extremely important for the development of Persian poetry, and that is the real heritage. So once you get to Persian poetry, for example, in the Hindustani context, they are building on the themes which have then been articulated by Iraqi, by Maghribi, by Badi, and others in that pre-Mughal period. And that's why, you know, terms like Hasti Mutlaq, Hami'us, really arises from that context. Now, this school of Ibn Arabi is and how it arises in India. And I think, again, this is important to recognize that there is actually a very long history of this. It doesn't just start in the Mughal period. I'm going to be focusing soon on the Mughal period, but it's very much earlier. So we know about Fakhruddin Iraqi. How many people are familiar with Iraqi here? Right. How many people are familiar with Bahaduddin Zakaria? Exactly. So Iraqi was a disciple in the circle of Bahaduddin Zakaria. And so we know that Lama'at, which is a wonderful poem, was in circulation basically in Punjab already in the 13th century, and there are later commentaries which are written. Al-Aqi is one of the earliest conduits of the metaphysical ideas of Ibn Arabi coming into this region. And then, as I said, we've got Shah Ni'matullah Wali, we've got Maghribi, we've got Firani. Again, Jami, again, I'm assuming a number of people will have heard of Jami. Jami, anyone? Yes. Arguably the, Khatam al-Shu'ara, as some people would call him, at the end of the 15th century. His poetry was extremely influential in this context, heavily influenced by themes from the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. He also has a commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam of Ibn Arabi, which was also extremely influential in Hindustan. Then alongside that we have other kinds of, so this is the first kind of category I'm talking about here is poetry and the poetic reception of Ibn Arabi. Then we've got a kind of a critical reception of Ibn Arabi, or reworking of Ibn Arabi, which starts with Alauddin Sennani. Sennani is a figure who was quite critical of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, but was still very much a Sufi who had similar kinds of tastes. And there's a particular argument about the nature of existence, which we'll come to in a bit, which then emanates, which then influences some of the later debates that we have, for example, in the work of Sayyid Jahangir Ashraf Sennani, the Lataif Jahangiri, again, a very major figure, a very major Sufi of the pre-Mughal period. So that critical reception of Alauddin Sennani is something which I'll come back to in a second when I talk a bit more about its existence. Then we have the formal reception of Ibn Arabi through prose works, and this is where, for example, the commentaries on his Fusus al-Hikam come. There is a commentary by Sayyid Ali Hamadani, the famous Sufi of Kashmir, Halil al-Fusus. There's commentaries by Ibn al-Mahayni, and of course Jami, as I mentioned before. One of the interesting things about the Sayyid Ali Hamadani is that there's always been a bit of a kind of a question mark about what that commentary is. There's supposed to be a Persian one and an Arabic one, but they are actually available. Unfortunately, in most cases, they are mislabeled. So around 20 years ago, a commentary on the Fusus was published in Iran and attributed to Khaja Barsa, and it's actually not by Khaja Barsa, it's actually the one by Sayyid Ali Hamadani. And then finally, just to quickly mention some of the independent treatises. So these are works which are on different aspects of Tasawwuf and the metaphysics, especially of Tasawwuf, which do not explicitly mention Ibn Arabi or any of the texts of Ibn Arabi, but are a very important conduit. So we have, of course, Sayyid Qais from the Deccan. Asma al-Asrar is one particular text, there are many others. We have the Risat al-Wujud of Wajduddin Gujarati, who is a Shabtari in the 16th century. And we have this text by Fazlullah Burhanpuri, who dies in the early 17th century, At-Tuhfa al-Mursala ila Ruh al-Nabi. It's a relatively short, like 18-page work in Arabic. It had a certain significance in Hindustan, but actually had a bigger influence in the Malay world, because it was taken to the Malay world and widely disseminated and translated into Malay and so forth. And just quickly to say why that's important. So we often talk about Persian Islam, right? Islam in Persian and the way in which Persian works influenced Islam and the spread of Islam. So it's impossible, for example, to talk about Central Asia and China, Islam in these contexts, without mentioning Persianate texts. The same thing goes for Southeast Asia. What people often don't mention conduit is Hindustan. Right? The Persian texts are not coming directly from what is now Iran. They're coming through Hindustan, they're coming through Western India, and they're going through the northern part of Hindustan, through into Central Asia and China, and into Southeast Asia. So much so that in the Chinese and Southeast Asian context, it is impossible to think of what the Islamic tradition is without looking side by side at texts which are Arabic and in Persian. In many cases, scholarship began with the study of Persian texts. It started with reading works of Jami and so forth. It started with reading works of Sa'di, of other famous Sufis of the 13th and 14th century. Right. Now we kind of get into the Mughal. Into the Mughal period. Now there are two figures I want to mention in the Mughal period. Again, Dawah, I'm sure, is familiar to everyone, either whether for positive or negative reasons, but that's a different matter. We'll leave that aside. Dawah was certainly a fascinating figure. The prince who never quite became a king, and the whole question of why that happened, of course, is complicated. We're not going to go into it. But a lot of his works are explicitly kind of engaging with the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. For example, I've given them in chronological order roughly. We have the Risale Hafnuma in 1645, which deals with the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, and seems to have actually arisen out of his correspondence with Muḥibbullāh Ilāhābādī, which I'll mention in a second. The second one is Sajjad Akbar. How many people know the Sajjad Akbar? How many people know it's actually been translated recently into Urdu? So it's just been translated by Azmi Dr. Safavi, who is a retired professor at Aligarh. It is a wonderful translation in Urdu. It would be actually great if there wasn't a Pakistani edition of this text as well. It's an absolutely fascinating text because she does an amazing job of working through the translation of the text, presenting it, saying which parts of the Upanishads are being translated here. And it's actually very much a snapshot of what the Upanishads were at that particular period. Because in different parts of, in different periods of history, the Upanishads have broadly taken on different forms. And they are vernacular-ish Upanishads alongside the Sanskrit works as well. And then, of course, we've got the Majma al-Bahrain. Again, I'm assuming a lot of people are familiar. The Majma is a very important work of 1655. There's also, I think Samudra Sangama is the Sanskrit translation which was done after the Persian. And the Majma al-Bahrain, as the name suggests, is a confluence of the two seas. And the two seas of which there is a confluence, one sea is Islam, right? And Islam here is the metaphysics of the school of Ibn Arabi, and the other sea here is the darshan of Advaita Vedanta in particular, and so forth. And on that last text, there's an important kind of parallel with what's happening slightly earlier with the court poet Faizi. So there is a text called Sharik al-Ma'rifat in Persian, relatively short work, which is actually a reworking of the Vedanta Sara, which was extremely popular in 16th century Hindustan. And Sharik al-Ma'rifat is again predicated very much on this idea that Islam and Advaita Vedanta are ultimately, and that is actually quite important for a number of the Sufi figures in this context, is that they consider the issue of truth in a holistic manner. Truth is not something which is, let's put it this way, truth is not sectarian, if I can be as bold to say that. Another figure who is parallel, is very important, Abdurrahman Chishti. Incidentally, all of these covers are the Urdu translations. They're actually easier to get hold of than the Persian originals, which does mean that I hope that means that there is some readership out there for these works. Abdurrahman Chishti is slightly later than Dar al-Shukr. His three important works, Miraq al-Haqa'iq, is again about this intersection, this confluence of Yoga Vedanta in this context, and the metaphysics of personality, this concept of Waqt al-Wujud, which I'll come to back in a bit. But it takes the form of a paraphrase of the Bhagavad Gita. There was a very important Mughal imperial cultural project to translate the major works of the Sanskritic Vedic tradition into Persian. And the reason for why they were doing that is because Persian was the dominant language of court. More people understood Persian than understood Sanskrit, of course. But also there was a sense in which, as an imperial project, it had to reflect who the Mughals were. So the Mughals were the rulers of Hindustān. They were not, again, kind of partial rulers only interested in their Muslim subjects. They were interested in all their subjects. And they like to consider themselves as standing above these sorts of sectarian divisions. There's a very famous passage in Jahangir's Majalis-e-Jahangiri, which was edited by Arif Noam Shahi about 20 years ago, in which he says the function of the emperor is to stand above the divisions of the communities. That doesn't mean the emperor does not have religious affiliations. That doesn't mean the emperor does not respect the religious affiliations of others, but it's not their job to intervene in those aspects. It's for them to engage and support all the communities that they have. Then we have his Miraq al-Asrar, which is his Tazkira al-Chishti Salvari Silsila, this period. And again, another very important work is Miraq al-Makhluqat, which again goes back to Vedic texts and engages in a certain kind of polemic on metaphysics with some simplifications of Naqshbandi ideas. I'll put it this way. I won't say it's a direct engagement with Naqshbandi ideas because there's a common kind of assumption that the two big orders in Hindustan are the Chishtis and the Naqshbandis. And the Chishtis are basically enamored of Ibn Arabi, and the Naqshbandis are kind of anti-Ibn Arabi. It's actually not anywhere as simple as that. It's much more complicated. Your Chishtis are critical of Ibn Arabi, you've got Naqshbandis who love Ibn Arabi, right? So, but there's this broad kind of idea which is about a certain reception of Shaykh Ahmad Sirhindi, which assumes this kind of juxtaposition. But that in itself is incorrect because if you actually read Sirhindi carefully, you realize that he says things depending on who the audience is. So he has positions on Ibn Arabi which are very much of praise and ones which are of critique. And there's also a recognition that when it comes to something like Waḥdat al-Wujud, which is often translated as unity of being, there are different ways in which we can interpret it. And there might be ways of interpreting it which are problematic, right? So you could interpret Waḥdat al-Wujud to mean everything is God, literally, which is not what the contention is. Or you can go in the direction of saying only God is Wujud, which means everything else is secondary, is contingent upon the very reality of God. So it depends very much on how we are defining Waḥdat al-Wujud in order to make sense of the reception. And of course, one of the most important things which comes out of Waḥdat al-Wujud is this concept of Sulh-e-Kull, right? Now there's been a bit of academic dispute recently on this. There are those who say, well, Sulh-e-Kull is actually something, it's a political program that Akbar had, right? It's got nothing to do necessarily with metaphysics. But the notion of Sulh-e-Kull predates Akbar. Akbar may have used it in a particular way. And this is why, again, it's a good parallel to the different ways in which you can see Waḥdat al-Wujud. You can see Waḥdat al-Wujud in a broadly pantheistic way. You can see Waḥdat al-Wujud in a broadly monistic way, right? And similar things with Sulh-e-Kull. You can see it as a political program associated with Akbar's Ibadat Khana and so forth. or you can see it as something which is about a universal ethics, which is promoted in the devotional centers of the Chishti shrines in particular. So, you know, the shrine is not the same space as the court, and that's it. That difference is important. Now, I should probably speed up a bit because I'm going slowly and I don't want to kill you with boredom. Let me just say a couple of things about some 18th century figures before I come to my main thing. Again, in the 18th century, we have a lot of work on the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. We've got poetry, we've got commentary and independent works, and so forth. Now, the Chishtis, you've got Shah Kalimullah Jahanabadi. Again, you know, I kind of feel like everyone should know who Shah Kalimullah is. He was a huge figure in the 18th century. It's kind of astonishing that even you know, Khalif Nizami's Tazkir Mashayikh Chisht barely gives 2 pages or 1 page maybe to Shah Kalimullah. He's by far the most important 18th century Chishti figure there is. A number of his works, his Maktubat in particular, Sawar Sabir is another one which is defending Muḥibbullāh Ilāhābādī, we'll come back to. Alongside him, of course, everyone knows about Shah Waliullah. One of the problems, just not to kind of go on and on about how completely desolate and useless the study of Islam is, but one of the biggest problems is the Arabic versus other languages issue. Those who read only the Arabic texts of Shah Waliullah will encounter a very different person to those who would also read his Persian texts. And I would argue that works like the Hama'at and Sata'at, which very much are metaphysical contemplations, are far more significant in some ways than most of the Arabic works of his. And then the final thing I'll quickly mention here is poetic transmission. So he directly cites the Fusus and the Futuhat, and those passages are not in Andali. So he clearly did have other ways of accessing Andali. And I think at one level this could just be a very simple case of deferring, you know, to his master, to his spiritual master. But there's an interesting question of why you would make a claim you've never read Ibn Arabi when you clearly have read Ibn Arabi. And I think it tells us something about how we might see influence. Now, very quickly saying something about Wujud before I come to, and I've mentioned a couple of things already. You know, is Wujud something which is singular? Is everything that exists, is everything God, or is it rather that everything is Wujud as a manifestation, expression of the divine? How do we understand concepts like Wujud Mutlaq or Hasti Baqt or Hasti Mahaz? Where does phenomenal plurality come from? Every one of us experiences the world from phenomenal plurality. In the very fact that I'm standing here, you're sitting there, you're aware of this, you're aware that there are different individuals and different items and entities in this room, suggests that is a kind of a common sense idea. But the question is, how does that then relate to what reality is, sort of underlying or as it truly is? Mentioned Solekul, and one of the ways in which this kind of juxtaposition happens, partly through response to the critique of Fatih Shuhud, is this famous phrase of, on the one hand, Hamios, and the other one, Hamiazos. Yeah, so everything is, he is everything, or everything is from him. Now, the two figures, speeding up rapidly. First, Muḥibbullāh Ilāhābādī, born in 1587, dies in 50, I think it's 1652, but I've just suddenly forgotten where it is. He studied in Lahore again. it's important. We forget Lahore was one of the major intellectual and cultural centers for the Mughals, and he studied with Abdul Salam, who himself was a student of Fathullah Shirazi. So Fathullah Shirazi is this pivotal figure who makes his way from Shiraz first to the Deccan and then ends up at the court of Akbar in Agra. He is considered to be the founding figure in the teaching of the rational humanities or the intellectual humanities, that what are known as the Maqulat. And so everyone talks about lineages which come back from Fathullah Shirazi. Famously, the lineage which takes us to the Farangi Mahal and to Mullah Nizamuddin in Lucknow. More people need to work at Farangi Mahal. And we shouldn't rely on things which are published merely in English. Francis Robinson is a wonderfully nice and sweet guy. He does not read Urdu. Let's not kid ourselves. He does not read Arabic. He does not read Persian. So his understanding of Farangi Mahal is very, very limited. Right? We need to stop kind of genuflecting and doffing the cap to like the white academic. It's nonsense. Right? Don't do it. Please don't do it, especially those of you students. Respect scholarship, don't respect the person who is saying it. It's the famous saying of Amir al-Mu'mineen, pay attention to who's saying something, don't pay to what they're saying, don't pay attention to who's saying it. Right? And he is associated with the Chishtis. His peer was someone called Abu Sayyid Zamgohi. Later, of course, he established himself in Allahabad. Allahabad is an important figure. He corresponds with Dar al-Shukr, and I briefly mentioned. And he also he's interested both in Ibn Arabi, he's also interested in Avicenna. Now, there's a number of works, just to mention the two major things. One is the Taswiyah. So the Taswiyah is his famous work where he defends a particular doctrine of wujud, using the language of Avicenna. And people think that it's kind of a critique of Sirhindi. This is completely false. It's not about Sirhindi at all. It's not about Wahdat al-Shuhud. It's really about a particular critique which is articulated with Khaja Khurd, who is a bit later, of course, in Sirhindi. And it's also responding to Mahmud Jaunpuri. Mahmud Jaunpuri is the most important philosopher of the 17th century in Hindustan. But he's very much an Avicennian. He's not someone who's engaged in the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. He's on the Burhan side. He's not on the Irfan side, so to speak, right? So this text is very much responding to those particular arguments, bringing together the language of the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi with Avicenna. And then, of course, Muḥibbullāh has two commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam of Ibn Arabi. One in Arabic and one in Persian. The Arabic one is relatively short and concise, and the Persian one is longer. To give you a parallel, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ashraf Ali Thanvi's commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam. Ashraf Ali Thanvi does something very similar. He has a very short, incomplete commentary in Persian, and he has a much longer set of commentaries and comments in Urdu. And it's the Urdu work which is more important, and in this case it's the Persian work which is very much more important. A number of other works, I mean, this is just a listing. I can have the PowerPoint shared later if you want to follow up. Most of these works of Ilāhābādī have never been published. They are mainly in manuscript. A book called Translating Wisdom indicates something which is interesting. And we kind of need Shankar to do that because, unfortunately, there are very few people who can read Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian nowadays, and can really kind of seriously engage with texts. So, one of the things he suggests is that, in this broader kind of debate between Ilāhābādī and Khaja Khurd and Mahmud Jaunpuri, there are potential kind of interlocutors in the broader kind of Vedic darshanas. So he refers to the famous 16th century Advaitan, Vedantan philosopher Madhusudana Saraswati, and how he makes a certain argument which is against. So there's two types, broadly two types of Vedanta. There's Advaita and there's Dvaita. There's non-dualist and there's dualist Vedanta, which very much comes back to the fundamental question about unity versus plurality. And John Puri's kind of insistence that when we talk about wujud khas in particular, we have to be talking about the reality of individuals, right? So John Puri's position is that each one of us is a wujud khas, and we have a reality in and of ourselves. And this, as Shankar suggests, is reminiscent of this concept of Vishesha in the Nyaya Visheshika school, who are broadly speaking metaphysical pluralists, just like the Advaita Vedantins are metaphysical monists. Now, Bēdil. So Bēdil is Turkic origins, born in Patna, became a Qadiri Sufi, ends up in Delhi. He was for many years in the entourage of the Prince Muhammad Azam, who was one of Aurangzeb's sons. And he had a very important intellectual media, for example, students. So these guys are really important. Khan Arzu, again, how many people have heard of Khan Arzu? Sarajin Khan Arzu. Yes. Again, Khan Arzu was perhaps one of the most important people writing about the nature of language in Persia. You know, there's this famous thing where you know, the notion of Indo-European languages and the idea that languages have families and how they relate to each other and how languages resemble each other because they're related, is often associated with William Jones, who's a bit later. But Khan Arzu, before William Jones, already articulates this notion in a number of his works. He's a direct kind of disciple in the circle of Bēdil. You've got Anand Ram Mukhlis, who is a poet in his own right. You've got Vrindavan Das Khushbu, who is one of the most significant Daskara writers of the 18th century. Now, Bēdil is concerned with this question of unity of existence, or wahda, in a number of his works. I'm just going to say a few things about some of the Masnavis and so forth. Bēdil's corpus is usually, so the classic kind of modern Kabul, Afghan edition of Bēdil, which was produced in the 1960s, comprises 4 volumes. So one volume is prose works, one volume is the Masnavis, and 2 volumes are the Divan of the Ghazals. This is a huge corpus, a massive corpus of work, because each of those volumes goes into like hundreds and hundreds of pages. Now, if we just consider the Masnavis, so Muhyiddin Azam, which he completed in 1667, which is a kind of roughly a middle length Masnavi, 9,000 verses for him. It took him 24 years to complete. His student Arzu referred to it as a Persian Fusus al-Hikam. So that tells you something about it. And he meant it in 2 ways. One was that it was about the engagement with Ibn Arabi's ideas, but the other one was that it was also about the structure of the Fusus. So if you aren't familiar with the Fusus, one of the key elements of the structure is that each chapter concerns a particular wisdom associated with a prophet, a Quranic prophet or prophet who is mentioned in Hadith. Another work which does similar things is Tur Ma'rifat, which was completed in 1668, much shorter. And there's a number of themes which come out which draw on Ibn Arabi's works. I've given you, for example, the idea of religious pluralism, the idea there is only one true faith. I don't know how much time we have to actually read all the verses, but we can come back to that.